So, welcome everybody to our lunch with Yaroslav Trofimov, a native of Ukraine who is fortuitously here, as already remarked, individually on the day that President Zelensky is visiting President Trump in the White House and signing what may prove to be a historically significant, a historically turning point deal for Ukrainian mineral rights development. In partnership with the U.S. I'll say more about Mr. Trofimov's background as the chief foreign correspondent of the Wall Street Journal. Very fortunate to have you. Fortunate,
my pleasure.
Available.
Well, thank you again for having me here. Couldn't pick a better day with President Zelensky just down the road.
Right down the road.
Having just met, both sides of the Congress and his compliments from President Trump about his sartorial choices. So let's just remember where we were this day 3 years ago. The Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, had just visited the White House to see President Biden. As he told me, he felt like he was being given this diagnosis of terminal cancer. This was supposed to be a farewell meeting for him and for his country. President Zelensky was sitting in Kyiv and was besieged by Russian troops. The calls he was getting from Boris Johnson in London, but also for Washington, were proposals on how it would be evacuated and set up government in exile in London, just like Polish government exile was set up. Poland was around. And that didn't happen. Ukraine managed to roll back the Russian onslaught on its own, pretty much, in the very first weeks of the war. It's kind of now lost in the fog of memory, but yes, there has been this very long and very sizable American and European commitment in terms of weapons and funding, but there was none of that when it started. When it started, Ukraine was denied its request for heavy weapons by its allies. Germany famously vetoed it. Estonia sending some Soviet howitzers that got from East German arsenals, because the expectation was everyone being fall in 2 days in Moscow and in London, because I think there was a profound misunderstanding of what Ukraine is and what the Ukrainian statehood is and what Ukraine is fighting for. We have until now, Vice President Vance talked about ethnic hatred and ethnic conflict, but the war in Ukraine is not ethnic war, it's not a war for a particular language or religion or ethnic group. It's a war based on a very new understanding of what is to be Ukrainian, a very new Ukrainian nationalism came out in the last 30 years of Ukrainian statehood. If you look at the Ukrainian nationalism of the 20th century, or early 20th century, like pretty much every other European nationalism was ethnic-based, toxic, and, frankly, anti-Semitic. There's a very good book by Ukrainian historian named Yaroslav Trofimov, recently was explaining the thing. When we talk about how Ukraine is different from Russia because it's looking west, well, the Western values in the 1930s values. So we were not fortunate. But the new Ukrainian nationalism that was born in part in the Soviet prison camps for Ukrainian dissidents, were the same camp as the Jewish refugees, Baltic and others, was based on this idea of a Ukrainian identity based on the notion of freedom. So when Ukraine became independent in 1991, it chose the path of saying that the former president Kravchuk told me that everybody who works for the benefit of Ukraine is Ukrainian full stop. So Ukraine now happens to have a president who is Jewish, Minister of Defense, who happens to be a Muslim, etc. And the head of the armed forces, General Syrski, happens to be an ethnic Russian, was born in Russia and came to Ukraine as a teenager. And that is the secret of the resilience in Ukraine because, well, everybody was expecting it to split. Everybody outside of it was expecting it to split along this cleavage of language and religious lines. The Russian army attacked such limited numbers, fully expecting many people at least to side with the invaders. That didn't happen because the idea of Ukraine is something very different. And so, I have written 2 books about this. One is this one, and in Slovenish. That is really a history of the Ukrainian resistance in the first year and after the war. It starts the night before the invasion and ends October 2023. War in Gaza and world attention started to shift away from conflict. And I wrote another book that just came out. It's a novel called No Country for Love, and it's based on the life of my Jewish grandmother. Comes from the town of Uman, and the survival, the time when Ukraine was the deadliest place around 1953, because the element of history is very, very important to understand what's going on. It's impossible to understand Israel without understanding the Holocaust and the role that the Holocaust is playing. It's a given, right? But Ukraine's history is unknown to the rest of the world by design. It was hidden by the Soviets with some publicity from Western enablers, and it's really like Ukraine itself, it's sectarian in the Western mind until this started. The reason why Zelensky is so popular, was so popular abroad, is because people didn't know him. It was the first Ukrainians that actually recognized. And but this history is tragic, but just to throw numbers at you, Ukraine lost at least which had a population of 28 million people, so Ukraine in the late 1920s lost 4 million people at least. The official famine that was organized by the Soviet regime, that was hidden with the complicity of people like Walter Duranty, correspondent of the New York Times in Moscow, who won a Pulitzer Prize for writing articles about how famine existed in Ukrainian peasants might be prosperous. And then there was the wholesale elimination of the Ukrainian intelligentsia. Until now, outside of Ukraine have no idea about its writers and poets and painters who were executed at the time. Then there was the Holocaust, the destruction of Kyiv, the war. 10 million Ukrainians died in World War II. Jews, Nazis, Ukrainian civilians, killed crossfire, deported to Germany to work, starved, and then millions and millions of Ukrainians voted the Red Army against the Nazis. Ukraine paid a much higher price for the defeat of Nazis than Russia. All of Ukraine was part of Russia. And then after that, when the rest of Europe was going through peaceful reconstruction, Ukraine had insurgency past that. And this weight of history is very important to understand the fighting now. The war began with President Putin writing an essay of history, which he said was called Ukrainian under the historical unity of Russian citizens. He said in this essay, which was published in the summer of 2021, read to every soldier who was in Ukraine that the Ukrainians and Russians are one people with a common destiny, and the Ukrainians do not deserve a separate path. And soon after the invasion began, the full-scale invasion began, the state news agency in Russia published another essay called "What to Do with Ukraine," what has to be done with Ukraine. And the blueprint that they had there was a return to this genocidal policies of the 30s. Essay argued that you have to physically exterminate carriers of quote-unquote the virus of Ukrainianness, that is, Ukrainian intellectuals. You have to make the population in general pay the price and make it suffer for of trying to think it would be separate, and then you have to re-educate the children. And so while now there's talk of moving towards peace, and obviously nobody wants peace. Ukrainians are the ones who must expect the direst price for this war. But the reason why the Ukrainians continue fighting now, 3 years on, despite horrendous casualties, is that this idea of never. Whereas the message that they hear from Russia is, on one hand, never happened. The first thing that happens when Ukrainian towns are occupied is that the monuments to the victims of this famine are being demolished. It's described as an invention of Ukrainian nationalists, even though it's recognized as an act of genocide by the US Congress, Parliament, in Europe. And then but also this other Russian slogan, "Sможем повторить, repeat." And they're glorifying, again, the people who carried out some of these tragedies of the past. One of the first things that happened, for example, in the city of Melitopol, which is the biggest occupied city in South Ukraine, but they named the street after a man named Pavel Sudoplatov, who ran Stalin's overseas domestic assassination network. He was responsible, for example, for Trotsky in Mexico. It was a figure so odious that even in Soviet times, after the death of Stalin, he was put in prison. 15 years in Soviet prison. He was so covered. But yet now he is the new hero, and there is a unity after. And so that's where we are. And hopefully the progress made in the White House and further. But I think the fact remains, Ukraine did not collapse 3 years ago, and Ukrainians don't see any other choice except fighting, just because the Russian goal has not changed. The goal of eliminating Ukraine as a separate state remains the goal of President Putin and modern-day Russia. And unless and until there is a realization in Russia that that is not achievable, a long-term end to this conflict seems not really aggressive. So, happy to answer any questions.
Okay, well,
About Ukraine and about general implications of all this for European security, because I think let's not forget that when this war began, President Putin had a meeting with President Biden, and the demand that he made went far beyond Ukraine. He wanted NATO, as we know, to be rolled back to where it was during the Cold War. He wanted the renewal of a Russian Estonia exploited Russian land, and Ukraine was like days than anymore. And so he's choking the appetizer now, but it doesn't mean that his initial plan has been shelved.
and what was the next course, you think, after the appetizer was supposed to be digested 3 years ago?
Well, I think the immediate next course was Moldova.
Mm-hmm.
After that, perhaps the Baltic states.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were very open about Moldova.
Mm-hmm.
There were Russian generals talking responsibly to that, some Moldova.
Mm-hmm.
And they did not think so that's not us.
Mm-hmm.
But as I mentioned, I was just in Munich.
Were you there for the conference?
Yes, I was there for the conference. And I spent a lot of time talking to European military planners, and if you ask German generals, they have the year 2029 marked in their calendars as the year when they think that Russia will have built its military and military enough to attack NATO, the United States.
By 2029.
Yes. But that time is there because Ukrainians in their blood gave Europe that breathing room. And the Europeans have really wasted a lot of time, with some exceptions like Poland, which has really taken their defense seriously. And if you look actually like what Poland is doing, they're not helping Ukraine very much because they are preparing their own defenses in case Ukraine collapses. So they're building their own marginal line in the Ukrainian border.
What's the role of competition to
People, I guess, to
Yeah.
sacrifice. Well, North Korea provided more artillery shells than all of the European Union last year, 1 million shells. They're providing, I think, hundreds of long-range howitzers. Yeah, that's more than the French and British armies have together. They sent 12,000 people. I think about a third of them are killed by now or injured. They have been very successful because they're all fighting in the Kursk region, but Ukraine has taken Sluga off in August last year and is still controlling a significant part of it. So, but I think it's a two-way street because I think it's a way, if you talk to South Korean military officials, they will tell you that they're very concerned that the North Korean troops are there to learn to apply the lessons of modern warfare and the Korean Peninsula. If you look at the world today, there are only two armies in the world that have an experience of modern warfare against the near peer opponents, the Russian and the Ukrainian armies. The U.S. and Korea has not fought against a sophisticated opponent since World War II. And so, and the technologies of warfare, the drone technologies especially, the two world leaders in drones now, it's Ukraine and Russia. And because it's getting adapted and changed in a few weeks, things will work, better work. And that's just the battle of Kursk gave us a whole new thing with the optical wire guided drones, which didn't exist before. Now because Ukrainian warfare, normal drones don't really work. Suddenly there's drones that have, a amount of wire that allow you to escape electronic warfare. This is a new development that just was going on the battlefield. And so China is watching Iran, is watching Russia, and North Korea is watching Iran. So that's great.
Yeah. Is it your view that Putin, let's say, this gets negotiated and Putin comes out very strong in Ukraine, or nothing gets negotiated and they continue to fight forever? I think you mentioned in your remarks that you believe that Putin would go for Ukraine and then into Western Europe. I mean, the Baltic republics, are we talking about places like that? Poland, really?
Well, you said Moldova first, and then ship to the Baltic.
So let's imagine several scenarios, right?
Yeah, and I'm just trying to project because everybody kind of knows what's going on here. Trying to understand Washington.
Yeah, so let's just look at the numbers, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the Ukrainian army today, armed forces, it's about 1 million men, combat hardened, experienced, 3 years in war. Commanders know what they're doing as they fight against the Russian culture. How many troops are there in West Europe? If you add up the British army, the French army, the German army, the Italian army, the Finnish army, it's still even fewer. I mean, Ukraine right now is the shield of Europe.
Yeah, it is indeed.
And none of the Europeans could come to Ukraine to protect Ukraine. Yeah. And so if that force is not there, or if that force gets incorporated into the Russian army, if Ukraine comes under Russian dominion, Ukraine's military industries that are now churning out new million artillery shells here, more than Western Europe, come under Russian rule, we're going to stop that. And also, if Ukraine is handed over by the US on silver platter, who's going to believe in any credibility of any actual fact there is? An American president that gives Ukraine to Russia is not an American president that will risk nuclear war against Ukraine. Or war.
Everybody is very concerned about this. I just can't imagine that even this administration would do that. I just can't imagine.
Well, lots of unimaginable things have happened. I wish I could share your optimism, and I'm usually very optimistic in life, but which is something the Board of the United Nations last week, in which the United States voted with Russia and North Korea on the resolution against Belarus, against a resolution condemning Russia for the war in Ukraine. Resolution approved by 93 member states of the nations. Even China and Iran, thought it's better to abstain.
And interestingly enough, everybody here has opinions about U.S. politics and the change in administrations, but I'm trying to look from your perspective, and you look down the road, and I never think of NATO as, the weakness that it would have if the United States military is not engaged in, via Article 5, that, who else is there to do this? The Brits and the Germans, they don't have standing armies, It's just impossible for me to get my brain there because we've always been on the right side of this, no matter who's in charge. Well, great.
Yeah, I mean, the Europeans have the capacity if they want to.
Yeah,
and now they have the urgency. One remark I heard in Munich from a German official was, we've had 10 years to wake up calls. So the next wake up call will be an air raid siren. So better get going. And
the wake up call seems to be, so I can just throw my own experience. When I served in Sweden under President Clinton, 1994 to 1998, the idea of Sweden moving into NATO was inconceivable. It was because of Article 5. And then 3 years ago, when I started wearing this pin 2 weeks after the invasion of February 22nd, Swedes were starting to talk about it, and the party that was always against it, the Democratic Party, was leading the charge to join NATO. So everybody said, well, Putin's great mistake is he invades Ukraine, and because of the NATO border on the other side of it, and he creates this phalanx of Sweden and Finland now on the north side of it. And what a great miscalculation. But I can't imagine that even if the United States, for whatever reason, figures a way to stay outside of this, I can't imagine that Europe wouldn't act to combat any further invasion beyond Ukraine. This is just my emotion coming out.
Well, there are two reactions to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
One reaction is what we see in places like Sweden or Finland. It's, okay, there is a security threat, so let's get stronger, let's invest in our defense, and let's be serious about it. Mm-hmm. Another reaction is what we see in Georgia, for example, where it's like, well, we should appease the Russians and be nice to them because we don't want to be in Ukraine. We see the same in Slovakia, which flipped. We could probably see the same in Bulgaria and Romania soon, and the Russian candidates almost won the elections in Romania. So you could also see countries of the Euro-Eastern flank preemptively switching sides to be on Russia's good side.
Well,
that's not what happened in Poland. Those are Baltic states, but
formerly under the Soviet Union. You're saying that those
some of Yugoslavia, same thing, I guess.
Greece. So because the people want to go with the momentum sometimes. And then we have a bigger question of what U.S. policy towards Russia is. Because, I'm sure you have heard about, it's called reverse Kissinger, reverse Nixon doctrine that seems to have taken hold in parts of the administration. And they seem to have this, grand vision of splitting Russia away from China, giving Putin all sorts of incentives to walk away from his partnership with Xi Jinping, including Ukraine maybe, and this hope of weakening China that way, which is seen as the only threat. And obviously what has been achieved is reverse Kissinger, because the Russia-Chinese bond is not going to be in a substantial way, but China which has had two strategic goals in Europe over the last several years. One is to prop up Russia, and one to split Europe and the United States. And these two goals were incompatible between them, as long as the war in Ukraine was raging. Suddenly has both, on civil fire.
How this may be a bit of an obvious question, but I'm just curious because you go back home from time to time. Mm-hmm. How is the mysterious mysterious moves of the new administration about Ukraine. Insults to Zelensky, compliments to Russia, the idea of this minerals deal as being a strategic advantage for Ukraine, and as well as repayment for gifts that were given as gifts. How is this all being seen in Kyiv, or does it depend on who you talk to?
I think it's. This whole mineral deal thing is quite a saga because it started with Secretary of Treasury showing up in Kyiv, meeting President Zelensky, giving him some papers and signing down the line, sign away, all the mineral rights, all the rights to future ports, infrastructure, and else. So the was like $500 billion. We rightly said, well, okay, that's some lawyers. Also, I'm just a manager here. And I was later said.
Somebody with a real Congress.
Yes. Yes. And so now it's being negotiated down to meaningless declaration of intent that excludes all the currently developed minerals infrastructure. So it's only about the future. And there is no number figure there, and it's a pretty meaningless intent. But sorry, let me just
Please finish.
But when the Ukrainian, we're asking about how Ukraine look at this, I think the overall feeling is gasping, not just in Ukraine, but around the world, and how. But everything that the Russian and Soviet propaganda was telling us about America that was a lie over the last 70 years is now actually true. And how America went from this benevolent hegemon to a predatory state that wants to invade its own neighbors, threatens to seize Greenland. And it's kind of like living up to the worst stereotypes. And I think people in Eastern Europe and Ukraine traditionally have been some of the most pro-American people in the world. Freedom things called Ronald Reagan and watching this side of America that was unfamiliar to them is pretty shocking. And I think it's going to have a lasting impact. It's also shocking people in border states of Poland, and all of a sudden it makes, because there was this whole debate about European strategic autonomy, and people on the eastern flank used to look at Washington as the only source of security. But now that Washington really is switching sides, all of a sudden the ideas like French nuclear sharing are becoming much more relevant.
Go ahead now.
It's shocking to Americans too. Never in my lifetime did I ever think this would happen. This complete betrayal of Ukraine, the humiliation of Zelensky. But you talk about the two powerful armies. Both armies have been terribly depleted. They let prisoners out of Russian jails as fodder. Ukrainians have a limited, there's 60 million people, but they've lost a lot of people also. They are battle-hardened and they're passionate about what they're doing, but they have been decimated also. How do they become a great power with their limited military might?
I think Russia still.
North Koreans in.
Yeah, I think Russia did not. So they had initial started the war with a professional army, which was massive loss. Then they mobilized 200,000 soldiers forcibly in September, October 2022, and they have not had a mobilization since then. So they just still. They emptied the prison, like you said, right correctly, they sent lots of prisoners with the promise of freedom to fight, they're dead now. And now they're still able to recruit enough volunteers because they pay starting bonuses. Basically, they pay very, very high bonuses and benefits. So basically, if you are a Russian male in your mid-30s and you sign up for the army and you get killed, your family will get more money as your entire lifetime earnings. Wow. So it makes economic sense. And they can only do this because no one really seriously interrupted Russian oil exports. And the Biden administration made sure that Russia could still keep something oil because it was received cheap oil. Plenty of buyers in India and elsewhere. Ukraine was told not to attack Russian crude oil export facilities. They can attack. Water Novorossiysk is easily within reach, and it alone exports 25% Russian crude oil. And so as long as this money keeps flowing, they can still find enough troops to fight, but they still have all this other reserve that they can conscript force. But also, if Russia were to take over Ukraine, we have seen what happened with us. In 2014, Russia occupied, the Donetsk, parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk region, and just ahead of the full-scale invasion, in January 2022, pretty much every able-bodied man over there was conscripted and sent to fight the fellow Ukrainians
In Donetsk.
and Lugansk. And hardly any of them is still alive because, mortality rate there was 80% for front lines. And so if Russia were to take possession of Ukraine, it would conscript the rest of the Ukrainians. That's something fighting against Poland. I mean, the traditional Russian expansion always was like that. You colonize an area and then use its people to colonize the next area, and it's reverses. And frankly, if this Ukraine collapses because of an American betrayal, this stab in the back narrative will actually create quite a few volunteers for generations.
An article of faith, I guess you could say, of the Ukrainians since the beginning of the war had been that the only settlement possible would be the recovery of Ukraine's invaded lands, which include, of course, the eastern provinces, and ideally in Crimea. One of the things, of course, now in the dialogue is that it's all hopeless. It's a hopeless, unwinnable war is the slogan of the day. But what was the thinking in Ukraine about how that goal, which is the goal consonant with the UN Charter, of which Ukraine was a member before Ukraine was an independent country, how is that goal to be achieved?
So let's see what happened. In 2022, Ukraine actually inflicted a serious battle on the field, the defeats of the Russians, and they recovered about half of the occupied territories. Mm-hmm. So 50% of land in Russia was regained by Ukraine. And then there was this counteroffensive that came too late in the summer of 2023 that failed. And there was another counteroffensive in September 2022 that was extremely successful. It was stopped because the US refused to back up Ukrainian weapons technology because it was afraid of Russia. Because the idea was that if the large Russian formation is surrounded and defeated, that's what really works. So the reign is held, and historic opportunity was missed at a time when Russia only had about 100,000 troops, and Ukraine had the numerical advantage. That window was closed because of the so-called escalation action policies that paved the way to the current trade. I think after that it became clear that Ukraine is not going to be able in the immediate future to recover Crimea, Donbass, and much of the other territories. And Russia has been on the offensive since, let's say, October 2023. It's an offensive that's very, very costly. It cost Russia hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but not terribly productive. If you look at the gains, Russia went from just under 18% of Ukraine to just over 18% of Ukraine. So, a year and a half fighting, they couldn't conquer 1%. And so it's not like Ukraine is losing the war. There is this stalemate situation in which the lines are holding. Ukraine is not winning and Russia is not winning. I think there is realization in let's talk about it, that Ukraine does not have the manpower to go to Ukraine. They does not mean that Ukraine will recognize as their share loss formally as permanent. But I'm sure that there could be some kind of armistice pre-Democrat lines. Armistice between Syria and Israel. Syria never recognized this massive war. It was, which Cyprus was divided now since the 1970s, and second of the Cyprus has unrecognized Turkish control of 37%. So that precedent for this. But I think the big question is, and things change. We just saw Syria in December, just as everyone reconciled themselves to the idea that Assad is there forever, then everything collapsed. Cards and the regime gone. And we saw in Croatia, which also had this sort of frozen conflict in the 90s, and then a few years later it was Operation Storm, and they managed to liberate all of the territories. As long as Serbia was there. So I can see this sort of temporary solution to that, but that's not the issue. The issue is not what happens to 80% of Ukraine outside Russia. The issue is what happens to the rest of Ukraine. And the issue is how to prevent Russian invasion of the rest of Ukraine, which is where security guarantees come in, and what continuing supply of weapons comes in, and where it's crucial that any agreement does not limit Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And we've seen really worrying signs because we had a special week of go to Moscow, spend 3.5 hours with President Putin, and come out and say that the framework for the future deal must be the Istanbul Agreement, well, the Istanbul Protocols of 2022, which were never signed by anyone, which were the draft for Ukrainian surrender, which imposed a very, very low cap on Ukrainian military numbers, on the kind of weapons they would have, and a ban on foreign assistance to the Ukrainian military. So Ukraine would have to live under these kind of restrictions would be taken over in 3 days, and the war will come 2 years down the road.
An assurance policy that the Battle of Kyiv would never have the result again that it had the first time.
Exactly.
I don't want to. I noticed, first of all, that all the Republicans are sitting on this side of the table. And two Democratic, except for Alma, of course, her husband, but two Democratic appointees and a nonpartisan person is sitting on the other side of the table along with our staff. And they're asking all the questions, except for me. So there's something wrong with this picture. But primary problem is, yes, well, please, go at it, Marta.
Non-political questions. So actually something you said already introduced this question, and that's really, we talk a lot about strategic questions related to future Ukraine. Mm-hmm. That's very important, of course. And then there's the military aid, etc. Also equally important. But there's a third part of this is non-military aid and assistance and support to Ukraine, so that it can continue to fight, but also it can reconstruct, it can make sure that the part of the country that is not occupied, people can continue to live, survive, do reforms as it's doing it, right? And I just actually spent previous week in a resilience-focused event where I spoke to a good friend of mine, Yaroslav, who's also a cyber advisor to Ukraine. And I realized actually so what happened here at USAID has quite a bit of impact on Ukraine, because there was support to this non-military aid and assistance and counseling and advice giving process. That really brings me to this sort of bigger question of how do you see the biggest needs for support as we move forward in terms of these non-military things that Ukraine needs, not just from America, but also from, as we're looking towards how can Europeans do more to support Ukraine. What are these key elements that Ukraine actually needs? What do we need to talk about?
Yeah. So obviously you say cuts do have
Ukraine, and Ukraine's internal political cohesion is something that is really targeted by the Russians, because their hope is that because of the economic pressures, because of the political pressures within Ukraine, the society will fracture. They will give them the victory back. So, and Ukrainians are still in Russia, so this got cracked in Russia. 2 years ago. So this is one of the domains of this war. But I think if you look at what the Europeans could do, I mean, it's not about giving money to Ukraine, it's about opening markets. And so we have already seen the backlash even in Poland about Ukrainian agricultural exports. Because Ukraine has a very sophisticated and consolidated farming sector with large companies that are very efficient and against which Polish farmers cannot compete because Polish farms are very small and traditional. And so you already have, a year of Polish farmers blocking border crossings, not allowing exports. But you have this writ large in many other industries where Ukraine is competitive to make money. So the issue is now for the European Union is if you really think this is your national security priority, well, then hurry up with the Ukrainian integration and with the Ukrainian market access. Because that's much more important than charity to Ukrainians to aid.
Such as.
Yes, but
going in, then they have to with their farmers. So I think, if the European leaders really say this is, as they do now, this is an existential conflict for Europe's future, well, you have to, maybe kill some sacred cows. But there is no security for Europe without Ukraine now.
Just a quick two things before I ask my question. The interesting part of it also is the infrastructure for access to markets. 2 years at the time of the invasion, I had commissioned a small carving from a Ukrainian craftsman who, a couple of days after he sent me, I don't know when I'll be able to fulfill my order. I said, don't worry about it. They say, we'll deal with that later. Subsequently, we stabilized. But so since then, I've actually bought quite a bit of actually wood carvings for the videos of my home. But to get it to market, to get it to me, transfer money to him is the easy part of this craftsman. He has to put it on a truck. It was the pole and ship out to Poland. And so it's an involved process to get it to finally gets delivered here. So I think there's a lot to be done on that. It's fun. But the way I've never quite stood. No one denies the extraordinary courage that the Ukrainian forces have had since that day 3 years ago. But the one thing I've never quite understood, no one has ever said why there wasn't a general mobilization of here we were invading, everyone, I'm 18, I went and registered for selective service, but it wasn't until a year and a half ago when they started taking the 26 to 28-year-olds, but there was an entire cohort that was never mobilized, and I never quite understood why that didn't happen sooner.
That's a very good question. So, and the very simple answer,
the age distribution population pyramid of Ukraine, it looks like this. So for every 20-year-old, it's 2 or 3, 4 because people do not make children. In Russia as well, do not make children. So there's just not a lot of people in that age mobilized. And if you consider this as an existential core of survival of the nation, then your priority is to make sure that the nation produces itself. So you really want to make sure that people in the 20s have children before they get killed in front. It's sort of this very sort of simple calculation, and so on the social level, it was since the very beginning the idea is rather me go and fight so my kids don't. And that's not to say that there are no volunteers in that age. There are lots of soldiers who are young who are volunteers, and there are many more now because there's volunteer measures to bring them in. But this is a consensus in society. You need to protect your generation as much as you can. Yes,
That makes sense. I mean,
yeah.
I've never had actually a specific explanation of why. It always, for an American, it was really American men, age 18, we all saw.
Yeah, but there's also a subsidiary explanation for this because, and it's modern warfare. You need people who have experience, know how to drive a tank, shoot a howitzer, and those are the people who serve in the Soviet Army. People in their 40s or the 50s especially, they all went through that, they all know how to do it. Like young people do not serve the army because they aren't in the army. And so we don't have a lot of people with the skills and the age either.
If I could, for a little follow-up, the other thing that gets very little attention, except in my view, the wrong time here in the U.S. And I realize you might make editorial choices when we're right. I was surprised when I read your book. There was no mention of this whole issue of the jurisdiction of the Orthodox Church and the Onofre and Epiphany and that whole, which is now migrated. That fight has migrated to my part of where we're in Africa with the Russians running around, and not just the Wagner, but also the bishops running around and creating. How has that played out on the ground in Ukrainian society?
Not much, to be honest.
The previous president, Petro Poroshenko, he invested a lot of capital in, gaining this ecclesiastical independence for the Ukrainian church. Because the Ukraine is a country of many denominations. So you have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kyiv Patriarchy, and you have the Greek Catholic Church. And so this whole idea of independence for the Ukrainian church was a big deal for him. And in fact, he ran for re-election on the slogan, army, language, faith. And he was trounced by Zelensky. So I'm running against corruption. Zelensky got 75%. And so the blessing of Ukraine is that it does not have a state church. There is no state church. And so people have their individual freedom and pay what they want. And there was a movement now recently to strip away some of the parishes from the Russian Orthodox Church because it continued its allegiance to the Patriarch of the Russian Church, who's been blessing the Russian army, actually been sending priests to spray holy water on missiles and tanks. So obviously you cannot tolerate a structure that has a lot of money, a lot of real life influence that is reporting in such Russian defense. If you were to visit the headquarters of the Russian church in Kyiv before the war, I was shocked by sort of how many black BMWs and armored Mercedes were parked around. But I don't think, it's kind of blazing debate in the US. There's always this whole sort of talk about Zelensky outlawing Christianity, which could be further from the truth. But in Ukraine itself, this whole church dispute is not a factor of politics. Again, the Russian Orthodox Church has been an instrument of the Russian state throughout history, and of the Soviet KGB, Soviet period.
Thank you. Kind of shorthand your previous answer, talking about what hope was there for winning in Ukraine, recapture the seized territories. Basically, I think your answer was shorthanding. There was a hope in 2022.
Yes.
But the moment was lost because of the nonpartisan timidity and intimidation of the Biden administration by the threat of escalation or some such thing. And the moment was lost. So that subsequently, after 24, into 2023 and beyond, there's been at least a tacit, if not a overt recognition that this is going to have to result in some kind of negotiated outcome truce peace, which will result in some alienation of Ukrainian territory. Some alienation of territory. So my kind of follow-up question is, is there anyone who's seriously considered the possibility that Russia could lose this? What I mean is, you just described the Russian professional army as having been chewed up. The Russian professional army was chewed up fundamentally in the first month of World War I, in the battles of the Syrian lakes, which began the military unraveling that ultimately led to the Tsar's abdication, stuck with military train by a bunch of unionist strikers, basically, and revolutionaries. There's a lot of indication that Russia is not in good shape. There's a narrative that says, they have the momentum on the battlefield, they're winning, they have this inevitable manpower advantage, which is, of course, why they imported Korean troops to go try to retake Kursk. And so the odds inevitably favor Russia, but do they? I mean, the exhaustion of military supplies, the anecdotes are not data, but the interview with, movie such things as exist in Russia, movie moguls, to get back their old Cold War relic movie props to use in combat. The parlous condition of the economy, the fact that there was a revolt, brutally dealt with, but a revolt within the first 8 months of the war. All of these to me, and the fact that, as Fred Starr pointed out in an article last fall, provided for us by Grace, our very people communications director, about all the indications that were growing at that time of people dissenting in ways that could be identified and where it might not come safely too close to high open windows. There I would argue there's plenty of evidence that this war is not going well for Russia, and that the main barrier between a reasonable and humane solution and what's happening now is Putin himself, who simply cannot afford to admit defeat, domestically or otherwise, or to accede to anything that even looks like defeat. But was there another path? I mean, this is the path we're taking, but was there another path?
There was definitely another path.
I mean, what's going on here?
In 2022. I kind of alluded to this, but let's look at the numbers, right? So in summer of 2022, Ukraine had 400,000 people in its combat formations. Russia had about 100,000 because it lost so many mobilized. But Ukraine was asking for tanks, fighting vehicles, missile systems, combat aircraft, and all of this was laughed off and denied. Can you imagine German tanks again in Eastern Europe? And without much discussion, right? And so when Ukraine suddenly surprised everyone with its breakthroughs in Kharkiv and Kherson and started pressing and ran out of ammo, there was a series of conversations between Washington and Moscow, and Burns and Pushkin, and there were always sort of intercepted Russian communications that it later transpired were deliberately allowed to be intercepted, of Russia preparing a nuclear response in case of a significant conventional defeat on Russian forces in southern Ukraine. And so that pipeline was closed. Ukraine was reined in, and the offensive ran out of steam towards November that year. And all this mountain of steel, quote unquote, was delivered to Ukraine the following year. And Ukraine did receive, the Abrams tanks, but received Leopards, received hundreds of Brennan vehicles, received with long delays the F-16. But by then, Russia had mobilized and built fortifications and was ready. And so by then, it became impossible to break through this line. So this is a historic opportunity that was lost. But now, speaking about Putin, though, I think for him, to freeze the conflict at the current lines would still be a mission of defeat. Yes, because any freezing that maintains Ukraine as a sovereign country that is able to defend itself, that is not a Russian proxy state, would be a failure in his original war aims, which is why he's not likely to accept it, which is why he is, sorting out this Istanbul understandings of that, and I think this is something that is not yet quite understood here in town, with all this optimism about a good deal, because any deal that preserves Ukrainian independence is not going to happen. I mean, any deal that is not a deal that allows him to regroup and attack again in 2, 3, 5 years' time.
So looking for trapdoors.
Yeah.
Elections, military limitations, wrong kinds of countries, incapable kinds of countries, as peacekeeping forces, etc. So we gather obvious traps.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But elections, it's not like there is a pro-Russian candidate in Ukraine now.
Yes, but there is.
They're reawakening.
That they will not get any. There's not going to be a pro-Russian candidate who can win elections in Ukraine nowadays.
What would happen if Viktor Yanukovych, I don't even know if Yanukovych is alive, but what would happen if a character like that were on the Ukrainian ballot?
You get like 1% probably.
Okay.
He's hated by everyone because he was a coward who escaped.
Mm-hmm.
He's hated by the Russians too.
How do you see
The United States can far more aggressively do to put a much tighter hold on the economic impact against Russia. Because you're not hearing from the United States, Europe at all, speaking about how to financially starve Russia, because it can only continue to do what it does because it can afford to pay for it.
Right. So Europe did its thing by cutting off its dependence on
and paid an economic price for this. The U.S. refused to pay the economic price of cutting off Russian oil supplies. The U.S. didn't pay any economic price for it. Actually, it's profiting off it by selling LNG to Europe. And so as long as Russia is allowed to rake in billions and billions every day by selling its oil, there will be no end to this war. Russia, because it can afford to pay this,
Absolutely.
bounties. And the other instrument we have is obviously Russian assets. $300 billion, not sitting in Belgium. But again, there was a reluctance to seize this, because once you seize these assets, there is no going back. So as long as you hope for some appeasement to Putin, you have to keep that money available.
But why would you think that there's a possibility of change of heart?
But again, we do know since 1550 they've been pretty consistent. So.
Well, and they've also.
I'm just confused. Obviously, every nation needs to do what it needs to do to keep itself healthy and safe and prosperous. That's understandable. But on the other case, this is a lose-lose proposition. This war for everyone in the world, not just the Ukrainians and the Russians, for everyone, whether you're starving in Africa or the price of fuel here. It's a lose-lose situation. The Russian ethos will never change.
But, people keep trying every 4 years. Hit the reset buttons.
Keep trying.
Tired of that. It's been a couple hundred years, you think.
I actually remember sort of related to this conversation. I had a conversation some time ago about the sort of different perspectives in policy making in the United States and Europe, and I apologize in advance. But essentially, we concluded that, well, in Europe, when you do policy making, you're looking towards the future, but you always also talk about the past, and you have a long memory. There will be like, yeah, but you did that 25 years ago, so we're not going to do this now. Well, I think in America, this sort of, there's more hope about the future, therefore the conversation about the past and what we try to oh, maybe it will work this time. So there's a simply maybe different relationship with the past and how that affects our conversations, right?
And that's the case not just here, but Asia. I don't know, when Olaf Scholz and Uncle Putin going to Poland, of course, nothing but you know, the Utrecht Pact.
Yeah.
Completely overreacting, but this is the sort of memories that it stirs.
Geography matters.
Yeah.
I mean,
Especially if you're both.
well, geography matters in the entire world, where your minerals are, or who your friends and allies are, and who your enemies were and are.
But that's also in part because the U.S. has been, because geography is weird.
Isolated, yeah.
The U.S. lost every overseas war in the last 50 years and didn't pay any price for that. Right?
Well, except for the humans who lost. But with that said, at the end of the day, the quick path to stopping this is to financially starve Russia.
Absolutely.
At the end, because China can only pay them so much, and Iran can only pay them so much, and if Russia starved financially, it will slow it down and stop.
Way to do it.
If I could weave together a couple of,
Well, our elected public officials, our congressman and our senator can create laws that can do things.
Yes, they can.
Okay, so it's up to us, our dear citizens, to put a little pressure on our elected public officials to pay attention, because it's ultimately going to cost us in the United States far more money to fill up our tank or buy those eggs. We'll be paying more if we don't settle, if Russia doesn't stop this nonsense. So even for self-interest, we really need to do whatever we can to put enough legislative pressure in order to create, to make this impossible for Russia to continue to profit off of all of this and continue to do what they're doing.
Well, they're all supporting the president. And right now he's in a
But this goes back, it's not just the last 2 months of the new presidency, right? I mean, this war has been going on and it could have been prevented. And once it wasn't prevented, once it started, this war, we should figure out how to stop it. And you stop it by using all the tools of statecraft, not just blood of humans and not just the toys of DOD. You also use it in other tools of statecraft, and that is one of them is the economic tool. And we're not using it. We're just not using it.
well, he will betray us. Putin will betray us. I can
absolutely
assure you of that.
well, not to take us into the realm of the dreamy, but Aldona said, I believe, that, since 50-50, the Russians have been 15-50, roughly. The Russians have been pretty consistent, and the Russians will all never change. Vladimir Kara-Murza, who, thank God, first of all, is alive, and secondly, is here, and third, in my judgment, is quite possibly the bravest living person, since he survived his captivity and continues in a world where Russia poisons people off of their territory to speak out. Just wrote an article a couple of days ago, or published an article a couple of days ago, reverting to something he had said just before, actually from captivity, in the early days of his imprisonment, and using the anniversary of Boris Nemtsov's assassination to do it. That he still thinks Russia will one day be free, which means Russia will someday change. What do you think?
Well, in order to change, Russia needs to repent. I mean, Germany changed because it acknowledged what happened.
Yes, but Germany changed because it was absolutely defeated, and
Absolutely, yes.
a phrase that hasn't been used much around the table, but underlies many of the things we've asked about is, and what choice is there?
Yeah, Russia is being offered off-ramps will never change. And so at some point, something will happen when this kind of happen. Russia is a society in decline. It's a society with, shrinking population. It doesn't have much of a future, though it is because it had some tremendous brain drain. As a result of the war, Russia east of the Urals, the entire population of Russia is smaller than a giant city. But yeah, I mean, realistically speaking, the road to reconciliation with Russia is through Russian defeat and Russian revenue. But that is not in the cards right now. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen tomorrow, or a year from, or 10 years from now. History is unpredictable.
Yes. Before we get up from the table, though, you have worldwide responsibilities, and there is a larger world than Ukraine, although the fight for Ukraine will very much affect the wider world. Would you like to make some closing comments about the remarkable developments that, especially before the end of the year, in the Middle East, that, out of the tragedy of last October grew the decimation of Hamas, the decimation, of course, of much of Gaza, the decimation of leadership, with some stunning technological and intelligence achievements by Israel, and the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, which would seem to change the equation, including for Russia's presence outside of Eurasia. And maybe you'd like to say something about China and Taiwan.
Yeah, well, we're seeing certainly a reshaping of the world now, and it's not quite clear where it's heading. You do have this embrace by the Trump administration of this idea of 19th century imperialism, Monroe Doctrine 2.0, which is one of the reasons for this understanding of Putin, because Putin is thinking the same way. And so this whole system of alliances is very much in flux. Obviously, one of the countries that voted with the U.S. against Ukraine was Israel, and Israel does seem to have a free hand to do whatever it wants now with Gaza. This idea of turning Gaza to a beachfront condo and deporting 2 million Palestinians, seems to be like a serious idea. Everybody was thinking it's just a way of shaking up the Middle East, but it's not. So we are really in this uncharted territory where the Overton window, as you say, has expanded dramatically. And the most horrible things that seem to be impossible are now contemplated as rational policy. That's where we are.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.